Members of the crew on their fourth attempt today when they finally did launch. The commander, Francis Dick Scobie, veteran of the program. You see them at breakfast this morning before they boarded the Space Shuttle Challenger for this most ill-fated of launches. Also, pilot Mike Smith. Others on the crew, Judy Resnick, a veteran of a previous shuttle mission, Allison Onizuka, Ron McNair, Greg Jarvis, and, of course, school teacher Krista McAuliffe from New Hampshire. His husband and two children were watching the launch and obviously were eyewitnesses to that momentous explosion less than 2 minutes into the flight of the Space Shuttle Challenger.
Krista McAuliffe has been asked countless times why it was that she applied and why she went into the space program, and this was her answer.
I'm sure they're excited.
Why in the beginning did you want to be one of the teachers who applied for the program and fly in the space shuttle?
Well, it was a challenge, and it was something that I always ask my students, you know, to go and seek whatever they feel they can do and reach a little higher. The whole process was kind of exciting for me because I knew that there would be people from each state who would be coming together, and I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to talk with all these educators and exchange ideas, and that was really fun. And that's basically why I decided to send in that application, never dreaming that it would get this far.
Were you a fan of the
space program? Which she certainly was. In fact, listen to her kids over the last few days talk about her, because we've all been up there in New Hampshire, right, wanting... I think we should make one point very clear here, that the attention that invariably falls on Krista McAuliffe today is in no way a reflection of how sadly I'm sure the nation feels about the other 6 crew members on board. But because she was the first true citizen to fly on board, because President Reagan had so surprised the world during his 1984 re-election campaign when he said that a teacher was going to be in space, she has attracted an enormous amount of attention. One of the most impressive things, listening to her students, is how she managed to take in her classroom theory and practicality and put it together. It wasn't enough to tell kids about a canning factory. You had to take them to the canning factory.
And everybody remembers 1 or 2 teachers in their own background who had that same capacity to ignite the imagination and special interest that owns the appetite for education. Krista McAuliffe, obviously that kind of teacher, and the person who was selected out of 11,000 applicants to be that first private citizen public school teacher to go into space.
In fact, her high school principal, Steve, has already been quoted on the wire saying, "It is awful, it is just too awful even to contemplate." And as you pointed out earlier, about 200 pupils and teachers had gathered in the school auditorium to watch the liftoff live because there was so much pride.
Judith Resnick, the second woman aboard the shuttle on this mission, had been the second woman in space. That had become a routine now, to have women among the crew members on the shuttle program.
You ask my daughter, who women in space have certain magic for young women. I'll tell you, ask my daughter to name the highest woman in the world. She always says Sally Ride.
Sally Ride, who was first.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a reminder again of where we are at this point. You must surely now have a sense of this terrible tragedy that has occurred. About 2 minutes after liftoff at Cape Canaveral, something blew up. It is the opinion, and he's very cautious about offering an opinion at this point, of Gene Cernan, the former Apollo astronaut who's been contributing editor to us for a long time, that it was not the solid rockets which drive the shuttle so far towards its orbit that blew up, but it appears to have been something either on board or in the main tank, which was right directly underneath the Challenger. If you have seen the pictures, you've seen it happen terribly, terribly quickly. So fast, in fact, that the mission controller just simply went on talking at one point about what was happening on the mission while the explosion was actually taking place. You know that 7 people, 7 Americans, have died in this, the first accident to occur actually in the air. Those of you who've been associated with space for a long time will remember that the Apollo test crew, Virgil Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died when their rocket blew up on the pad. There was fire in the spacecraft and blew up back in January of 1967.
Once again, the explosion that took place at 11:39 this morning, less than 2 minutes after the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger with its crew of 7. We should point out that this was still in the period when the 2 rocket boosters were firing They have a firing time of 2 minutes and 10 seconds, but it does not appear that they were the principal cause of the explosion. NASA, being very deliberate and very careful in conveying any information, what we do know is that rescue paramedic teams have been sent to the area in the Atlantic where debris has been coming down. One of the problems, however, so much debris has been falling out of space that they had to delay the insertion of some of the paramedics to prevent them from being hit by some of the debris coming back into the ocean.
And that's the area we're looking at, Steve, the search area off the Cape. Recall the Challenger was about 10 miles up and 20, perhaps 26 miles, am I correct, Mike, downrange. And think back, if you will, for comparison to the explosion on board the Air India 747 in the Irish Sea, how long it took to pick through the incredible amount of debris that occurred in the ocean. So while we are all, in a sense, I think, waiting for the word from Mission Control, some sort of formal word, what I suspect we already know, the search for what has happened is going to go on for weeks, if not months.
The American space program, obviously, at its lowest point after the very precipitous and unexpected explosion this morning of the Shuttle Challenger. The Challenger had been delayed 3 previous times in trying to get off on this mission. Weather had been a factor. Technical problems had been a factor. Even this morning, there was further delay, in part because ice had gathered on the pad, 24 degrees at the Cape this morning before lunchtime. And yet, after the liftoff, everyone called it a perfect lift. NASA actually saying that there was no indication whatsoever of any trouble. Suddenly, the explosion.
Mission Control, just to repeat, gave us no indication whatsoever that there was any problem with the engines. And you heard Gene Cernan, who we'll talk to again in a second. You heard Gene talk about the capacity to break away the actual shuttle itself from the main engines or from the solid rocket engines. Were there any possible warning of trouble coming? But it was a mission described as being perfect up until the time the explosion occurred.
Nothing more revealing than what you have already mentioned, that the mission controller actually went ahead reading off figures even after those of us watching television had seen and sensed the horror of what had been happening. Let's go back now to John Quinones at the Cape, who has new information. John?
Steve, NASA is now telling us that those search teams are now going over an area 18 miles from Cape Canaveral in the Atlantic Ocean. They have not reported back on anything that they may have found as yet. It is indeed a sad tragedy here. When Krista McAuliffe went into the White Room for final preparations this morning before she entered the shuttle, she was handed an apple by a member of the closeout crew, and the whole crew wishing her good luck. The school teachers' parents were present here watching the liftoff in person, and they saw first a successful launch, as usual, a majestic launch. There were no indications that anything was wrong at that point, but then seconds after that liftoff, Challenger blew apart. There was no sound that we could hear of any impact or any explosion, just a reddish burst of energy, 2.5 million pounds of thrust and plumes and streams of white smoke. It reminded many of us here of the old Apollo missions. It looked to us like the separation of stages of that rocket. The first stage of the rocket would explode away, if you recall, and then fall apart, and then the capsule would continue shooting skyward. That's what it looked like from our vantage point. After the people in the viewing stands, including some school children from McAuliffe's hometown, were told of the explosion, some began to cry. One woman went as far as calling for an end to the entire space program after this tragedy, and perhaps a natural reaction after watching the tragedy here live. ABC News is now being told by a member of a contingency rescue team, these are men trained to recover the remains of a spacecraft in case of an accident like this one. He told us that if indeed there was an explosion of that force and that magnitude, there would be nothing left to recover. Officially, again, NASA has not even confirmed nothing. They're only saying that there has been an apparent explosion.
John, I think we both know that the space community is a pretty tight-knit community. Have you had any sense of how they feel in that community itself?
No, Peter, we have not. We have been monitoring NASA control and have not had a chance to go out, but obviously it is hit very, very hard on this community.
We are looking, John Quinones, thank you very much, at the search area about 18 miles off the Cape, and the sun beginning to break down across that portion of the Atlantic Ocean today. Gene Cernan is back with us on the telephone now. Gene, how does this affect people in the space community? How does it affect those of you who were astronauts? I mean, are you different than we are in this respect?
Yeah, it's. I don't mind to say it's devastating. I guess I said earlier, it's the kind of thing you legislate out. You don't ever ignore. You build the safest machine that human minds can create, and yet you know that anything that's worth it is worth the risk. Again, that's not to say that 7 lives could be exchanged for anything at this point in time. But it's going to be devastating, and this is not strictly in my opinion, a catastrophe for NASA or for the space community. This is a national, even an international catastrophe that we're going to have to examine very closely, look at it, and not live with, but...
Gene, would you stand by for just a second? I apologize for interrupting you, but Senator Jake Garn of Utah is now going to have some comments about this tragedy on Capitol Hill. We are trying to acquire the senator's audio from Capitol Hill, former member of a shuttle crew, as we tell you on the screen there, a man who has a deep dedication to NASA and who is one of its political overseers, in a sense, in terms of its budgeting. And we do not, it seems to me, Steve, need to hear him this morning to see exactly how he feels.
Certainly see the emotion on his face.
We go back to him now.
Yes.
And the benefits that come from it. And the crew members that I knew so well, I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator, you're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids, we don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. Just no way to know at this point.
What was your opinion of the amount of missions that NASA had scheduled for this year? Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather. That is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program is mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter. Yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capitol Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia, originally during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. We woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me when NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and this not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator, how lucky did you feel today that you returned safely?
Well, I don't feel particularly lucky. I think the program is reliable. In all programs, in flight test programs for aircraft, we have accidents, and I don't. It's a surprise to me that it happened, but I would go again tomorrow if NASA would let me go. I would go again.
What effect is this likely to have on a community of astronauts?
Well, first of all, they're all such a close-knit group. They're not looking any beyond today except the sorrow of losing some of their companions. You go through each one. I knew Krista McAuliffe the least of them because she wasn't there. Greg Jarvis I trained with. Dick Scobie I knew. Mike Smith was my mother hen, and you go on Azuka, flew in January last year when I was flying. So it's where they live together all the time, they train together, they fly together. There's obviously utter shock and disbelief down at Houston today among the astronaut corps.
On your mission, was the crew equipped with parachutes, and were there ejection seats?
No. Only Columbia had them at the beginning of the mission, just during the first, I don't remember, 3 or 4 missions.
Senator Jake Garn.
Thank you very much.
Senator Jake Garn from Utah, one of the Congress's most astute and devoted overseers of NASA, giving us really the first feel we have this morning from an individual of what it's like to be on the shuttle. We have heard it many times before from many people, but there is Senator Garn emphasizing some very important things. First of all, that he would go again if NASA would have a chance, that he feels safer in the air than he does on the roads of America, that he feels the country should emphasize safe driving, and making the point, at the risk of paraphrasing him, that man does not explore the heavens without some kind of risk. That risk leading this morning to the loss of 7 Americans, including 2 women, including the first teacher in space, in a catastrophic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, just as it was approaching that moment of separation when the solid rocket boosters fall away and the Challenger pushes on for its first orbit in space. And also saying that in response to criticism on occasion from some people that NASA delays unwillingly some of the missions, he was relating what it was like to wake up on a wonderful sunny morning at the Cape, find out there was a tiny thing wrong, and having NASA emphasize again that particular safety factor. Do not go until you are assured that everything is A-OK. And for those of you who have seen the now videotape or the live coverage this morning of the rocket going into space, it all happened so incredibly quickly. Senator Garn making the point again, as we've made a number of times this morning, that the particular space shuttle, the Challenger, did not have an escape capsule on board. Previous shuttles have had some facility for an escape on board. But making the point that I think must surely be obvious to any of us who have looked at this morning, that had there been an escape capsule on board, the force of that explosion going almost 2,000 miles an hour, reaching its maximum moment of thrust, and with all of that hydrogen and that oxygen together, and the space extra fuel tanks on the side, that even a space escape capsule would not have enabled these 7 people on board to survive. To remind you, 7 people on board, while Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, the woman that President Reagan had so determined to put in space, as teacher as the first civilian, the other people, just very quickly, before we go to the White House, to tell you their names again: Francis Dick Scobie, who was the commander; Michael Smith; Judith Resnick, who's flown, of course, in space before; Ronald McNair; Alison Onizuka; Gregory Jarvis; and, of course, Krista McAuliffe, on whom, for this mission at least, the nation had focused, as we'd focused on Senator Garn when he became the first politician in space. ABC Sam Donaldson is standing by now at the White House. Sam, I shared with you over there this morning the incredible sense of shock in the White House when the news was announced. What's happened subsequently?
Well, Peter, just a few minutes ago, the President came into the room in which a group of us were being briefed on his State of the Union message. He said it was a great tragedy, just a horrible thing that had happened. He recounted how they came in and told him, and he went and watched the television. He says, our hearts go out to all of the families involved. But under questioning, Mr. Reagan said the space program will go on. Of course, he said at the moment he wants to make certain before any more shuttles are attempted in the launching sense that it is safe. He doesn't know any of the details, but he says he has confidence in the space program and the people who administer it. And the President pointed out, rather philosophically, again in response to questions, that we have had accidents in all forms of transportation in the past, and we don't give up on the transportation. In fact, his exact words were, well, when something like this happens, it's a horrible thing, but we don't back up and quit. So he made very clear that he expects the space program to go on, Peter, but not until there's been a complete investigation and people can determine what's happened and make certain that it doesn't happen again.
I would think, Sam, that in terms of the Washington political structure, the President's really speaking for everybody, and perhaps for much of the country, that the program is now mature enough, even with the loss of 7 lives, which is very sad, to go on exploring the skies.
Well, that's true. Mr. Reagan pointed out that this is the first accident in which a fatality has been involved in the entire space program, except, of course, for Gus Grissom and the others who died on the pad in the early days of space exploration by the United States down in Florida. We've launched all of these flights, all of these shuttle flights, and they've gone off with no loss of life. He said that this program has to go on, and someone said, well, what would you say to the students who are waiting there, Mr. McAuliffe's students? And he said, I try to explain to them that when these horrible things happen, you just have to, and that's where you use the phrase, you just can't quit. You can't back up and quit. You have to go on.
In a nation that is so internationally renowned for our sense of exploration, Sam, I'm surely that's an answer that students would be satisfied with. What about the State of the Union tonight? The President is going to talk about the families, going to talk about the economy. Is it going to be a different speech now?
Well, the State of the Union speech will be held tonight at 9 o'clock at the regular time. Mr. Reagan had a reference in his speech already about the space flight. Of course, that reference has been deleted, and he's going to insert a new one. He will clearly begin with an expression of sorrow and sadness about what has happened today. What words he'll use, I don't know. I think they don't know at the moment. They're trying to discover exactly what they want to say about it. Then he'll go on with his regular speech. We asked him whether this wouldn't necessarily cast a pall over that speech, and he agreed it would, because clearly he was going to give a speech which was upbeat. He'd intended to say the State of the Union is good, things are very good, we're going to go forward. And tonight he can't really give that kind of speech without first talking about something that's happened that's very bad.
Sam, thank you very much. Sam Donaldson at the White House, where he and the President are preparing for, or were preparing, I should say, for the State of the Union message tonight, which is why all of us were over there. And now, of course, very much distracted by this tragedy in space, 7 Americans on board the Space Shuttle Challenger. One, by the way, of 4 shuttles which presently exist, Columbia and Challenger, the 2 we have become most familiar with, Discovery and Atlantis, the other 2 which are available to be used in space by, as we said earlier this morning, a wide variety of people who want to conduct experiments in space, everything from the American military to international industry to the launching of satellites. So at the risk of being too certain about anything, I don't think there's much doubt in anybody's mind, at least in this capital city, that the space program will, of course, go on apace after a suitable investigation of what has happened. We have talked, by the way, before we go, Steve Bell, who's done yeoman work here this morning, from very early this morning, has now gone off to prepare another program, and I thank him very much for coming and joining us and letting us join him. Gene Cernan, the Apollo astronaut, who's been something of an editorial advisor to us on space, is still standing by at the end of a telephone. Gene, this sense of going forward, that surely is one that's felt in the space community.
Peter, do you hear me okay?
I do indeed.
Yeah, there'll be a great deal of reaction, and I certainly believe overreaction, but, you know, the space program has become a part of our lives. Whether we like to believe it or accept it or not, it is indeed a part of our life, and it's a part of our future, and it will go forward. Obviously, there's going to be, as I say, a lot of overreaction. We'll take a look at this problem. We'll find out what it was. We'll solve it. We'll eliminate it for the future. And I think there's no question about the fact that we'll go forward. I heard Jake Garn, and I certainly endorse everything he said. And you know, he talked about safety and NASA being conservative. It was just a couple days ago I had a discussion with some of my colleagues about that very conservatism, and we both agreed, or we all agreed at that time, that you know, for the space shuttle to be truly operational, we can't let a few clouds bother us. We can't let a few ice crystals bother us. We got to reduce or remove some of that conservatism. It's sort of a paradox because of all that conservatism that something like this should come up to bite us. I don't think that there's any question, but if there's any criticism anyone can ever make of NASA, is that the fact that at times they tended to be almost too careful.
Gene, I know you can now see a television set where you are at the moment. Forgive me, but where are you?
Well, I'm in my office, the closest
Houston.
place I could get to be in contact with you, and I am watching on television at this point in time, so I have seen the sequences of the flight.
Gene, then if you wouldn't mind, we're going to look again at the accident as it occurred and ask you to give us the benefit of your knowledge as to what you see, not necessarily what you think might have happened. This is very slow motion, Gene.
Well, Peter, unfortunately, I'm going to do, but I just got cut off from your local affiliate here, so I think I've seen it enough. You'll have to keep me in tune of where we are, though, and I'll try and tell you what I do remember and what I do.
The explosion is just occurring, Gene.
Pardon, the explosion is just occurring. As I looked at it, it almost appears as if the explosion is occurring somewhere near the aft or the back end of the shuttle and or that external tank. It also appears to me, and again, far be it for me to speculate, try and be an expert at this point in time. It's going to take weeks and months to figure this one out. But it appears as if some explosion occurred at the aft end of the vehicle or aft end of the external tank, which, as we recall, carries the explosive
So, Gene, the heat shields, for example, on board the shuttle itself, which are designed for reentry, absolutely no use whatsoever?
No, that is to control predetermined heat that the shuttle has to dissipate during reentry, and that's a very critical phase in itself. But because the shuttle is a very flyable and maneuverable vehicle, the rate at which the shuttle absorbs that heat through its heat shield can be controlled. In this particular case, that explosion occurred in a matter of seconds, or certainly microseconds, and I had heard discussion about escape capsules and ejection seats. Being a pilot, being a test pilot, having flown aircraft and even spacecraft under similar circumstances, and indeed we had ejection seats way back on the Gemini space program. There were times that we knew that no matter what escape mechanism we had, we would not have been able to react quick enough, at least under circumstances which I just saw here this morning, to be able to use those escape mechanisms.
So, Gene, you wholeheartedly, I gather, agree with Senator Garn this morning that even if there had been an escape capsule on board, it wouldn't have done any good, based on what you've seen?
Based upon what I see, it almost looked like the Challenger was consumed almost immediately by the explosive propellants which were in that external tank, and an escape capsule certainly at best would have been marginally effective in this case. And whether we like to believe it or not, we've gone forward over the years and the centuries in the development of man, and certainly the development of this country, where in order to get where we wanted to go, there were certain risks we had to take. Obviously, this was one of those. Again, I want to emphasize, I happen to believe that space and space exploration is certainly here to stay. We will recoup as a nation, and I think we will move forward, but we will move forward, I think, just a little bit wiser, a little bit smarter, with a little bit more capability. If I might, Peter, I'm close to those crew members. They're the new kids on the block, if you will, but I've known them all, and I guess I feel especially close to this one because I happen to be on the selection board, the panel that selected Krista McAuliffe to fly in space.
Gene, thank you very much for a very thoughtful contribution to us this morning. We would be very grateful if you would stand by, because we are waiting to hear some reports from Mission Control in Houston. But ABC's Lynn Scher, who has covered the space program for us, I won't say longer, but certainly more vigorously, Lynn, than anybody else, and with enormous intelligence and grasp. You knew these people very well on a human basis. Senator Garn said something this morning that was terribly interesting. He said everybody has the feeling that the program is so safe. Is there an anxiety level for people?
Not really, Peter. It's quite amazing that these astronauts go about their jobs. They climb into the craft, they go up into space, and they don't really think about the danger, certainly not on a regular basis. Keep in mind that this crew is comprised mostly of professional flyers. Dick Scobie, Mike Smith, Ellison Onizuka, Ron McNair. These guys have been pilots for most of their lives. Judy Resnick, an electrical engineer who was, of course, part of that new group of astronauts who came in, the mission specialists, the scientists. And they were not used to this, the flying, the anxiety, any of that kind of thing. But they entered the space program because they wanted to go, they wanted to do it. And I don't think that they thought about the danger. Krista McAuliffe, of course, I'm reminded about the comment that I know our viewers have seen and heard from her principal, that she was not afraid of life. She liked new challenges, and that's why she wanted to go. And Greg Jarvis, part of another new class of space shuttle passengers, participants, a payload specialist, he was there because Hughes Aircraft had an experiment and he was going to be working it for them. I should point out to you also, Peter, that I'm out here in Los Angeles because I've been covering a far more joyous mission, which is the flight of Voyager 2 past the planet Uranus. And as a matter of fact, you talk about the routineness of the space shuttle flight. Most of the reporters who regularly cover the space shuttle missions are out here because the space shuttle had, in fact, become so routine that the Voyager mission was, in a way, far more unique.
Lynn,
so it has been a great shock.
Please stand by for just a second. I just want to do a little bit of reporting here that Rockwell International, which is the shuttle manufacturers, had no comment yet on this. There is going to be a news conference given by the space agency, NASA, at 3 o'clock. It'll be held at Cape Canaveral. John Glenn, who is certainly one of this nation's most famous men in space, is going to have something to say about 1:45. Lynn was going on a little bit there about the people who had flown. Then let me ask you about the three who had not flown before. They're Mike Smith, Greg Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. Do they go easily into this or not?
Oh, sure. They wouldn't be there if they couldn't adapt well. And, Peter, if I can just backtrack for 1 minute, I realize that Rockwell has not had an official comment. We have spoken to them out here in California. As you know, Rockwell, the company that built the shuttle, apparently the mood out at their plant, total dismay, shock. It's like a morgue out there. A sensation that I know is shared at a lot of companies, homes, offices around this country right now. But on that other issue, the astronauts get to, well, let's put it this way, the people get to Houston, they become astronauts, and they just get into that way of life. They are in trainers for a good deal of their time. They're flying in T-38s, which are those very small training, high-powered jet aircraft. They don't fly them if they're not the pilots, but they're in the back seat. They have oxygen masks on. They have pressure suits. They are used to the kind of danger that professional pilots go through on a regular basis. And they are not doing it necessarily because they want the danger, but they're doing it because they want to go into space and they want to do a job. And I think the danger is very far down the line.
Lynn, explain, if you would, a detail to me. We were listening, as you know, to the, and I've just had the transcript of the final communications between Challenger and Mission Control. We hear absolutely nothing after we hear the Mission Control commander say, throttle up. And he goes right on talking, even though the explosions occurred. Why might that be?
Well, for one thing, they have said they saw no anomalies whatsoever in the solid rocket boosters, in the engine performance, or in the shuttle itself. What they are doing, Peter, keep in mind, is not looking out the window. They are not watching the shuttle lift off the way the spectators are and the way we are on television. They are looking at screens. They're looking at monitors. They're looking at printouts. And they're reading their numbers. And their numbers did not tell them what, in fact, had happened.
And it sounds very much like, Lynn, given the speed with which everything happened, that the crew never knew what happened either.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think Gene is quite right. It happened so quickly. Those poor people did not have a prayer. They had no chance. And I think it was over very quickly.
Then let me ask you the same question that I heard somebody on the Hill ask Senator Garn. He said he would fly again tomorrow if NASA would let him. And you, I know, have applied to be the first journalist in space. Give you any second thoughts?
Of course I have second thoughts. By the same token, I think that it is the spirit of people who keep on going after accidents, after they're cleared up, after the reasons are understood, that has made this country wonderful. I think that if the first pioneers gave up when the first covered wagons were attacked, the West never would have been settled. I think that if the first astronauts had looked at those first rockets that blew up on the pad, without humans in them, of course, they might never have gone. We wouldn't have had a space program. There are some very brave people who have kept this country going and have kept us preeminent in technology. Sure, I have second thoughts, but I want to wait and see what NASA figures out and what they do about it.
Okay, Lynn, if you wouldn't mind standing by, we may have some further indication of what is going on, because the acting administrator of NASA has gone to the White House clearly to report to President Reagan, to the Vice President, and the White House staff, and there is going to be a NASA news conference at 3 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time, which, of course, ABC News will cover live. It is now, I see, now past another half hour, at least here in the East. So for those of you who may, in fact, be watching television for the first time today, we're going to show you again from launch the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning from Cape Canaveral in Florida, 11:39 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. Those are the big, solid fuel booster rockets, the white ones we've so accustomed to seeing on the outside. At some point, they are destined, of course, to break away as they drive the Space Shuttle Challenger closer to its orbit. That great, big cigar-like thing you see underneath Challenger is an enormous tank of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, the main tank.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Just under 2,000 miles an hour.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Go with throttle up. Take the extra boost. go for orbit.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And there you see it, about 2 minutes and 10 seconds after the flight began at Cape Canaveral this morning. That which you see flaming off into the distance is one of the external tanks, the solid fuel rockets going off on its own. Those great, enormous tanks which give the shuttle its initial early boost are designed to be recoverable. They are made of heavy steel and drop into the Atlantic Ocean for recovery and reuse.
Here looking very carefully at the situation.
This is a videotape you're watching.
Malfunction. We have no downlink.
No downlink, no communications, in other words, between Mission Control and the shuttle. 11:39 this morning Eastern Time in those jet blue skies over the Atlantic as debris falls towards the Atlantic some 10 to 18 miles from Cape Canaveral itself, because it wasn't, of course, going straight up, but downrange as well. And rescue crews and contingency rescue teams, as they call them, have now gone out into the Atlantic, had to wait for almost an hour.
From the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
A certain note of what do we do next from Mission Control in Houston this morning. I was saying that it took over an hour before the contingency recovery forces, as they were called, were allowed out into the Atlantic, because so much debris was falling from the skies, not only the great boosters. At the moment of launch, here is the McAuliffe family watching their daughter go into space. Those are her parents, her father, and her mother. And those, some of the school children with their caps on. Her mother clearly weeping with pride at that point. Those children at the Cape itself, very much like the children who had watched at Krista McAuliffe's school in New Hampshire, as described to us, for minutes did not know what was happening. It looked very much to us as if her parents did not know what was happening for some period of time. John Quinones, ABC's correspondent at the Cape, said to us earlier that, in fact, many people who were watching at the Cape did not know what was going on. Krista McAuliffe, the first pure civilian, the first teacher in space, with her parents and lots of children in attendance from her school at Cape Canaveral today. 24 space missions had already been accomplished before tragedy occurred on this one. And at 3 o'clock this afternoon, the space agency is going to hold a news conference to try to explain to us what they know. We don't know what they know in terms of what went wrong in this, the world's first reusable spacecraft. ABC's Lynn Scher is standing by with us in Los Angeles. Lynn, what do they look for first? I'm sorry, but what do they look for first?
Well, Peter, I think the first thing they're going to have to do is analyze that tape. They've got to be able to look at it. I assume they will, in computer, look at it as closely as they can to try to pinpoint where the first flash was, where the explosion took place. I know you've been through this a few times yourself, but here, of course, is the shuttle, the tank with the liquid fuel, the two solid rockets. They need to look and see if, for instance, the explosion began around here, then there was some kind of rupture of the tank with all of its liquid fuel, much of it still left for 6 minutes left of engine power. They need to see if perhaps it started in one of the two solid rockets. These are Roman candles, if you will. They are ignited, they cannot be stopped, they go off, they help it up, and then these two rockets drop off. Question, what happened? Was it in there? A spark, an explosion in one of these, misdirected, might have ignited the tank, and the shuttle simply would not have a chance. The external tank, which is full of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, has a very, very thin skin, and it would rupture extremely easily. The shuttle, which is designed to go into space and to come down and take that enormous heat of re-entry, is nonetheless also very thin-skinned comparatively. So it cannot withstand a major explosion. So I think the first thing they're going to do is analyze that tape. They will also go back over their numbers. I mentioned earlier that they obviously did not see anything at the moment of impact, but they're going to have to go back and see if there was any signal of something about to happen. Beyond that, they have complete records of every single part on the shuttle, on the tank, and on the two boosters. They will now go back and reanalyze every single part, when it was put in, when it was checked, what might have gone wrong. They've got to start there. I don't know where else to go.
Gene, let me ask you, Gene Cernan in Houston, recovery of the artifacts of this shuttle must now be absolutely critical, or can they begin some kind of investigation just based on telemetry and other data?
I think the answer to that is both, Peter. Lynn is exactly right. That there are reams and reams of data, not just from this flight, but from all previous flights which I made. They will go and look for some chronic ailment, something that you see occurring over and over again. But certainly every piece that they can recover, that they could put back together, much like an aircraft accident, is going to be very vital to finding out what the real answers are. I don't think anyone could do anything but guess at this point in time. Unfortunately, as we saw the pictures of the explosion, it was so catastrophic that it did consume the entire Challenger spacecraft. And when I saw the pieces
Gene,
coming
there
down,
it is again.
we're looking at it now in very slow motion. And when it exploded, it seemed to consume the entire shuttle vehicle itself. And there was no singular piece we could say, there it comes or there it is. So you can get a feeling for the magnitude and the quickness in which that explosion occurred, and literally consumed everything except those two solid rocket boosters, which appeared to be forced or broken away and fly their own path.
Gene, there appears to be on that particular piece of videotape, I'm not sure we can look at it again, there it is again, a flare right underneath the nose of the Challenger.
I do see it, and of course, Lynn is exactly right. She knows the vehicle, and as well as anybody at this point in time, the external tank that carries the very explosive propellants of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen is very thin-skinned, but it's done for a purpose. It doesn't violate safety. It has to be light to allow it to get into space and then burn up during reentry. It's possible a rupture could have occurred. There is also a barrier between the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen within the tank itself, which is very important because you don't want to mix those two propellants until you mix them appropriately in the rocket engines themselves. See the magnitude. You don't see anything of the shuttle vehicle at all coming out of this explosion,
There's the tank on the upper right. Can we roll that tape back just a second there? And we can see again one of the solid fuel rockets going off to the right of your screen there and shooting out of the picture. That, as you say, Gene and or Lynn, just goes off on its own steam.
Well, it goes off now. You know, there is nothing to shut it down. Obviously, it survived the explosion, and it does not have any guidance because the guidance was given to it by the computers on board the shuttle itself. So now it just is aimlessly flying until it descends into the ocean. But it probably the force of the explosion just blew one or maybe both of those solid rocket boosters away, and they continue to burn. As I said earlier, the solid is sort of like just a solid mass of gunpowder, and once you ignite it, it burns slowly and controlled, but it continued to burn.
And as Lynn was pointing out, there was enough fuel on there, particularly in the main tank, for another 6 minutes of flight. Lynn, is there anything on a shuttle reminiscent or resembling a black box that we get on commercial aircraft?
They have plenty
Lynn?
of data that should have...
Lynn,
I'm sorry?
I apologize, not your fault, but John Glenn, among America's most famous astronauts, has appeared to make a statement on Capitol Hill.
Repeat, that's for sure.
Under what effect does this have on a space program or any sort of flight test program when something like this happens?
Oh, it delays things, of course, because there will be a very complete investigation. Our view of what happened this morning would be only speculation at this point, although the very slow-motion pictures I saw on one of the channels a little while ago seemed to show the first light coming out of one of the solid rocket cases. Whether that'll turn out to be the cause of the difficulty or not, I don't know. But I wouldn't think that this was, what it'll do to the program or how much it'll be set back will be dependent on the investigation.
Was NASA trying to push too hard on this?
No, I don't think so. If there's one thing NASA has not done all the way through, it is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. It's been an amazingly successful program so far. You know, I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? We'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They've run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago. It's a tribute to them that they have not been goaded under pressure to taking any chances. And we'll just have to wait the accident analysis to see what happened in this case.
Senator, were you watching the blast off this morning?
I was not. I was in a classified briefing at the time, and one of my staff people brought a note in to me about this, and then I left immediately and went up to my office.
What was your reaction, particularly to the replays you've probably seen?
Oh, my reaction was a profound sense of loss, I guess, that this day had finally come that we'd hoped would never arrive. In some ways, I guess it's, in our human existence, let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
When you say that this was a day that was pushed back for a quarter of a century, was it inevitable that it would finally come?
Well, I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. we're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning that the answer to that is no. But that doesn't mean that man doesn't keep trying in these areas and that we're not just as dedicated to seeing that this kind of research goes on.
Senator, you've been part of a small and very select community of people, the community of astronauts. What does this do to that community when something like this happens?
Well, we've never had something like this happen before, except for the pad fire, the fire on the pad that claimed 3 lives. Gus Grissom, Ned White, and Roger Chafee back in '67, I believe it was. So we went through that tragedy then, but that was not an in-flight accident. Obviously, there will be a shared sense of loss in the whole astronaut group and community, everybody associated with the whole program, whether astronauts or all those in the supporting functions. But I'm sure their dedication is going to be to find out what caused this and correct it and get on with the next flight.
Do astronauts just simply accept this as part of the job?
I think any time you go into flying or test flying, or which all of us were in prior to being in the astronaut program early on, you accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks. And that's the way we looked at it back then. That's the way I'm sure all of the current group of astronauts looks at it.
How much more of a tragedy is this since it was the first launch of a citizen in space?
The loss of human life doesn't have much to do with who's military and who's civilian. It's a tragedy for their friends and families, and I don't differentiate between the loss of life, whether it was the regular flight crew or whether it was a civilian on board with them.
How much does it set back the citizen in space program, do you think?
I don't know. I have no way of knowing at this point. They had lined up some other people to go, of course. Whether this will affect that or not, I don't know.
Do you think it should?
Does this raise questions for the SDI program?
No, I don't think so, because the technologies that were being used here as far as thrust and the engines and whatever happened here, I think probably are not likely to affect the research going on for lasers and laser projection and formable mirrors and particle beam projection and things like that. I would not think it likely that there was a connection there.
Senator, are you concerned now, or have you ever been concerned about the way NASA procures parts?
No, I never have. NASA has bent over backwards to be as safe as they possibly can be. And whether this will prove to be a one-time difficulty from whatever cause, or whether it will be a design defect that is uncovered now that we can correct, or whatever, we'll have to await analysis. But there's no way of knowing right now, just now, a couple of hours after the accident, to know what happened.
Senator, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator John Glenn, one of the most famous flyers in this nation's history. It was back in 1962, I think, February 1962, when John Glenn became the first man to actually orbit the globe. Alan Shepard had been the first man into space, you'll recall. All of them. An important strain in the fabric of American adventure. Some of you may recall the movie The Right Stuff. And he sang, perhaps the obvious, with no insult intended, that the day has finally come when the accident occurred. Reflecting what many people have said this morning, including one Congressman Gray from Pennsylvania, who said we had become so accustomed to success in space that we simply were unprepared or ill-prepared for this kind of a tragedy. The Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill's office, has just said a short while ago, which will give you some indication of the impact of this tragedy here in the nation's capital, that the State of the Union message, which the President was due at 9 o'clock, is now going to be postponed for a week. We have not heard that officially from the White House, but Larry Speaks, the White House spokesman, is going to give another briefing in about half an hour, and we have, in 1 minute, in fact, and we have also been told by sources at NASA here in Washington that NASA does not plan, as we had told you earlier, hearing from Houston, a news conference or a briefing at 3 o'clock. John Glenn has said, as Gene Cernan has said, as Lynn Shure has said, that this is going to require very careful and probably lengthy analysis before we have any sense of what it was that caused this tragedy this morning and cost the lives of 7 Americans seeking the heavens. We are not perfect, said John Glenn, and of course the double impact today is surely because despite all the delays which have occurred with Challenger, but even more so with the Shuttle Columbia, we have become accustomed now to success in space. Wishes of bereavement and condolence have been pouring in to NASA and to this capital from around the world. The Soviets have made it clear this morning that they offer their condolences for the loss. The Soviets have a very major space program. The Soviets and the United States have cooperated in space back on Soyuz Apollo. And so this is clearly a tragedy, as a number of people have pointed out this morning, of quite international proportions. As the Space Shuttle Challenger goes into space and explodes and drives its rockets, as you can see on the upper right-hand corner of your picture, crazily off into space, consuming the Space Shuttle Challenger itself with the 7 astronauts on board. We've said a couple of times that because of the attention given to Krista McAuliffe, she's the one on whom the attention centers. But the others are, and those of you who know them will recognize them best. Dick Scobie, who was the commander of the flight, making his 2nd shuttle flight.
Due to the
Here is Larry Speaks at the White House.
Space Shuttle Mission 51L, the President, in consultation with the leadership of Congress, has decided to postpone the State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the Space Shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then the President said to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Did Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation
No,
about
the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the space shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the week? And what time is are the remarks tonight?
The President will will for the balance of the week continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry, the fall. 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Paramedics are being sent to the area where that chute is coming down, hopefully a chute containing the escape capsule for the crew. It appeared to be a good launch, and then you saw it.
1 minute 15
That
seconds.
massive
Velocity
explosion
2,900 feet per second.
over the
Altitude 9
Atlantic.
nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
This, the 25th shuttle mission, the first attempted from a second pad at Cape Canaveral, but obviously this one unlike any other. It had been planned for a 6-day mission, among other things to release and retrieve a satellite that would study Halley's Comet. But of course, the most attention going to the presence among the 6-member crew of Christine McCullough of New Hampshire, a school teacher who was to teach 2 lessons by satellite to school children all around the country from the space capsule. But now this massive explosion and accident, officials at the Cape simply do not know yet what the outcome is for the 7-member crew. John Quinones, can you give us your perspective of the launch and of the explosion?
Steve, we were watching it as it lifted off. It was, again, a picture-perfect liftoff. And suddenly then, about 90 seconds after liftoff, we saw this spectacular explosion. It just fell apart in the air. And we saw pieces fall and pluming smoke. We, at that time, did not realize what had happened. A part of the spaceship appeared to have continued shooting skyward. We did not learn that there had actually been an explosion until about a minute later.
What we're seeing now, of course, is a picture from Mission Control.
That is now floated to the ground. Again, recovery teams and paramedics are on their way over there to see, in hopes that, of course, that it is the escape capsule, one would hope, and that the shuttle crew, the 7 members of that crew, including school teacher Krista McAuliffe, are on board and would be safe. We have no definitive word, though, on survivors.
John, the latest word we're getting is that the chute does appear to have been large enough to have been the chute for the escape capsule, and that certainly will remain the hope of everyone here as we await the report from NASA officials and from the medical team that is on the way to the location of that chute. Here you see an earlier tape recording of the chute coming down from the massive explosion, and that is where the story and all our hopes lie at this moment. The hope that there can be survivors. A crew of 7. The first such accident in the shuttle program on the 25th shuttle mission. Once again, let's repeat the members, the 7 members of the crew aboard the Shuttle Challenger today. The commander, Dick Scobie, pilot Mike Smith, of course, the person that everyone's been watching, Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire, other crew members, Judith Resnick, Allison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, and Gregory Jarvis. The 7 crew members having to wait days through 3 previous postponements for weather and other technical problems. Today, their launch delayed at least 2 hours from the initial point of departure. Today, by faulty gauge and icicles on the pad. Now you're seeing the actual launch itself, and you can hear the cheers and the whoops in the background from Mission Control as it appeared to be a good, safe, and successful launch.
Challenger now heading downrange.
You can hear the voice of Mission Control, calm, calling off what appeared to be normal procedures.
Engines beginning
The role that's
down now.
built into
At 94%.
the
Normal
launch
throttles,
trajectory.
most of the flight, 104%.
This the recording at 11:39 this morning,
65% shortly.
nearly 15 minutes ago now.
Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs.
Well, we are
Velocity 2,257 feet per second.
We are now
Altitude,
told
4.3
that
nautical miles, downrange
the
distance,
chute we saw was not the escape capsule. And that is bad
throttling
news.
up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per
There was
second.
the
Altitude,
explosion.
9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
At that point, this 25th mission became something far different from any other for the Space Shuttle program. Plagued by so many delays in the last few weeks, so many questions about its economic viability. At this point, we're going to show you tape of the 7 crew members as they
You're looking very carefully at the situation.
boarded the Shuttle Challenger for the launch this morning. There you see the crew members. Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Mike Smith, Krista McCullough, Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis. This had been planned as a 6-day mission. And you see how the crew went through this procedure, this the 4th morning, because of the problems encountered, both technical and with the weather. This morning, more problems. A faulty gauge, icicles on the pad. This a live shot now at the Cape where you can only see the traces of smoke left in the air from the explosion that took place less than 2 minutes after the launch of the Challenger this morning. John Quinones, the latest word you're getting from the Cape.
NASA Select now, Steve, is not broadcasting anything on the rescue operations or on the cause of the explosion. There is silence here. Many of the telephones are out at the Kennedy Space Center. So there has been no explanation to hundreds of reporters that are here watching. Of course, the focus of this mission had been the flight of the first private citizen on a shuttle, Krista McCullough. We have information on the crew, of course. The commander was indeed Francis Scobie, born in Washington, in the state of Washington. He is married to June Kent of San Antonio, Texas. Commander Scobie enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. Pilot Michael Smith, he's from Beaufort, North Carolina. And his NASA experience is being one of the astronauts selected, a candidate by NASA in 1980, and has been in the program for 6 years now. One of the other astronauts, Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka from Hawaii. 4th astronaut Ronald McNair from Lake City, South Carolina. There were 2 women on board, Judy Resnick from Akron, Ohio, and of course Krista McCullough, born in Boston, Massachusetts. The payload specialist, Gregory Jarvis, he is born in Detroit, Michigan. We have no word on what indeed has happened to the crew, although, quite frankly, there is not much hope now that we've been told that the escape capsule, or what we saw come down by parachute anyway, is not the capsule containing the astronauts.
John, we've been told now that President Reagan at
magnitude of that explosion was, as you saw, very severe. It appeared that the shuttle
Thank you, John. We have been told now by Sam Donaldson at the White House that President Reagan has been alerted and has been watching tape replays of the shuttle accident. For those of you who may have just tuned in, there has been a serious accident involving the Space Shuttle Challenger on this 25th Space Shuttle mission. Less than 2 minutes after launch, a massive explosion off the coast of Florida, and it appears that there are no survivors. There is no final confirmation from NASA. In fact, we're getting no information now from NASA. There has been a complete blackout of information and communications. There was one parachute that came down. It was not an escape capsule for the 7-member crew. And this was a mission that had been postponed 3 previous times. Finally, after further delays this morning, what appeared to be a picture-perfect launch, and yet some 90 seconds later, that massive explosion in the sky. NASA control had been calmly clicking off the various elements of the launch that now here we're going to Larry Speaks at the White House, who apparently has an announcement coming up.
At what he has just seen replayed on television concerning the shuttle launch. We do not have any more information than is being provided to the public at this time. The way the President found out about it is he was in the Oval Office with a group of senior staff preparing for some questions with a group of network correspondents and anchors that were having lunch in the White House today regarding the budget and the State of the Union. The Vice President and the Foreign Policy Advisor, John Poindexter, came in with others and informed the President that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the President's study, where there's a television, and the President then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the President is concerned, he is saddened, he is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information as to the condition of the crew, Larry, at this point?
We don't have any more information than what is being provided to the public on television. Hopefully later we will be able to get some, and that's the President's first priority is to find out what information that is available. We just don't have any more. No, we have not from the Oval Office.
Will this affect in any way the plans for the State of the Union tonight?
I don't believe so. I'm certain that the President will feel compelled to mention this, depending on the outcome of what we learn here in a few minutes.
Will it affect the shuttle program?
Well, that's hard to say, here in 15 or 20 minutes after an incident of this type is concerned. I'm sure it will not affect the United States' determination to consider to continue the exploration of space and all the benefits we've received from it. While this is indeed tragic, it certainly will not deter the United States in its interest in space exploration.
All the problems that the shuttle has had, will any substantial reevaluation be done of the program itself?
Well, once again, you're very premature in asking a question concerning the future of the space program. The United States has met adversity many times before in the space program. It is one of the most effective and successful programs of that type that any country has ever undertaken.
Larry, can you tell us anything specifically that the President said, any quotations, and did he make any mention of the fact that the teacher that he suggested, that the program of a teacher in space, that teacher was on board this flight?
Well, I know that was on his mind. Quite frankly, the President stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this is very, very early, and there's just nothing we can say. Our immediate concern is the crew, and all of these other questions will just have to be deferred until much later.
Was anything said about the fact that the teacher was on board this plane?
Well, it was something that was on all of our minds, civilian, so to speak, other than our members of Congress who have flown in space, and certainly that's on our mind.
Are there any scientific aids who have been able to say that they could survive such an explosion?
Just don't have that kind of information
You said
yet.
that the Vice President Poindexter informed the President. How did the White House learn about it?
I'm certain that we probably learned it from the news media, as we do many times when incidents like this occur unexpectedly.
Might this influence the decision about whether other civilians will be allowed on the shuttle from now on?
Once again, all of these questions, our immediate concern is for the fate of the crew, to find out exactly what has happened to those 7 people aboard. All of these other questions, we'll just have to wait till later. Dale?
Anything about what the president's schedule, how the president's schedule is changing now?
The president's schedule has not changed. He will keep on with what he had planned today and the State of the Union tonight. And once again, I think the only change in his schedule would be to simply be updated and try to seek the facts.
Will the president be making any phone calls to the family, Larry?
I just don't know. It customarily does, but we're going to wait till we find out what the facts are.
Larry, you watched in silence, but were there no quotes that you could give?
Nothing. It was virtually in silence.
Do you know what's being done now, Larry, in terms of searching for?
No. That all of that information we just do not have yet. Dale, you had one question and you want to go? Okay.
What are your plans? What are your plans about briefing the rest of the afternoon on this?
Well, I think once we find out what the facts are and particularly what the fate of the crew is, then we'll be prepared to say something.
Larry, did you detect any sign of emotion as the president watched? Was he shaking his head? His eyes moist?
Concern, anxiety, silence.
You've been listening to a briefing by White House spokesman Larry Speaks. The president expressing his obvious concern. He's been watching the tapes, but he does not know any more than we do about the fate of the 7-member crew of the Challenger after that tremendous explosion less than 2 minutes after launch from Cape Canaveral this morning. With me now, Peter Jennings, who has been at the White House this morning and is here in Washington with me. Peter, you've been following this shuttle program like the rest of us. Just a tremendous shock so shortly after liftoff.
In fact, Steve, I must tell you heard Larry speak. So I was actually sitting in the White House with a group of other correspondents waiting for the president to come in and talk to us about the State of the Union message. And Don Regan, the chief of staff, was handed a note and said to us simply, the space shuttle has exploded, details to follow, at which point I fled the room. And I sympathize with Mr. Speaks at this point because he indeed is getting virtually all of his information at this point from us. That critical moment for people who have just joined us occurred as you've been telling us, thank you, with 90 seconds roughly after liftoff. And very interesting, as I rushed from the White House, almost the very first explanation, or perhaps explanation, was that it occurred as they went from power up. And here we see it again. You can see on the outside there, of course, those are the solid rocket boosters. And listening to John Lyons, ABC's longtime space observer, coming back on the radio in the taxi, John was saying, of course, if it is those solid rocket boosters which go, they would drive the Challenger itself totally out of control.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
There it is. There's the phrase, throttle up, which means they're going to increase from about 65.
There was the explosion.
There it is.
The interesting thing is we're being told by NASA control that it was a completely normal liftoff from their perspective, and prior to the explosion there was no indication of any trouble, as you could detect from the voice of mission control.
That's right. In fact, it must have been extraordinarily stunning in mission control for the mission control communicator to catch up mentally with what he was seeing on his screen, very much as we are seeing. The first air disaster, or the first in-air disaster, in the 56 U.S. man-in-space missions. You'll recall, Steve, there was a disaster on the ground back in 1967 during the Apollo program, but this is the first in all of the manned space programs.
Peter, we have tape now of NASA's first explanation of exactly what happened. NASA has been quite silent, but here is their information.
Repeating the information that we have at this time. We had an apparently nominal liftoff this morning at 11:38 Eastern Time. The ascent phase appeared normal through approximately the completion of the roll program and throttle down and engine
There you have it, Peter.
I was just going to say, Steve, one of the very first things we would like to have people behind-the-scenes check is whether or not Challenger had an escape mechanism. Columbia did have one, but I'm under the impression that the Challenger does not have the same configuration.
The parachute that we originally saw and reported as possibly an escape capsule is probably not a part of this new one. And as NASA Mission Control just advised us, the parachutes could have been paramedics dropping into the area of the impact of apparent wreckage in the Atlantic. What we have here is a situation where NASA nor anyone else is going to say what the final resolution is for the 7 crew members, but there is absolutely no hopeful sign from anything we've seen so far, that massive explosion. We have tape now of the 7...
Just before you go, let me just interrupt, because somebody did say to me a minor that, in fact, Challenger does not have the escape capsule. Columbia did in one of its early stages. We've had 24 of these missions. Columbia had it, Challenger did not. So what we were not seeing an escape capsule falling some 20, 30 miles out into the Atlantic.
Which, of course, does nothing to increase any signs of hopefulness. We were saying we have tape of the members of the crew early this morning as they had breakfast together before the mission. This 7-member crew, of course, the most prominent member, Christy McAuliffe, a school teacher from New Hampshire, the first private citizen astronaut from among 11,000 teacher applicants. As she is on your right this morning, her husband and 2 children were watching the liftoff on television. Other members of the crew, Commander Francis Dick Scobie, co-pilot Michael Smith, crewmates Judith Resnick, Ellison Onazuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, along with Christy McAuliffe.
Dick Scobie, of course, the Space Cap Commander, who has been an NASA astronaut since back in 1978, an experienced commander, and a tremendous setback this morning as you see the crew in a much happier circumstance, not long before they went off on what is surely, without question, the most ill-fated mission of the 24 space shuttle missions that have been flown in the last 5 years. Christa McAuliffe, as Steve has said, was clearly the most visible person on the flight, the first teacher in space, the first civilian other than a congressman, and ABC's Lynn Scher has been with her through much of the training program and now has a report on it.
That was a thrill. When she left her classroom behind for a semester of space training, 37-year-old Christa McAuliffe temporarily traded 12 years of teaching for a new kind of learning. Listen to her description of the airplane ride that simulates zero gravity.
As you peak that parabola at the top, you have about 20 or 30 seconds of weightlessness, and all of a sudden, just like Peter Pan, you start flying up, and it was just unbelievable.
That's the enthusiasm that's made her a favorite of students at Concord High School in New Hampshire. This is where the Boston-born social studies teacher lives with her husband and 2 children, and where she put together her winning lesson plan. It's clear from her NASA application that Kristen McAuliffe took special care to relate her classes here at Concord High School to what she calls the real world. Her philosophy of teaching, she wrote, stresses community activities. The economics class finds out how local construction projects impact the city. Law classes visit the local courts.
She can take very complex concepts and simplify them, but not water them down, and she makes all her students understand things, but in an interesting manner.
She was explaining, like, the assembly line process, and she went into this story about when she used to package Twinkies on the assembly line. And, I mean, I just laughed so hard, but I'm not going to forget it.
That's also what helped her application stand out among the 11,000 NASA received, and what changed her life.
The teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe.
Suddenly, she was a celebrity. McAuliffe and her family were paraded along Main Street and featured on the front page. When she reported to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, she was poked and prodded and outfitted and observed.
She's a sort of a risk taker. She does the unusual, the way she runs a class, and she's not afraid of things. She lives life. She's not afraid of it.
Teachers are always prepared.
And while she taught history and economics, her students figured out there was something else on her mind, too.
even on the quizzes, she'd throw in an extra credit quiz about what are the 5 names of the space shuttle. So we always knew her interest in space was high.
McAuliffe's crewmates have graded her well, acknowledging theirs will always be known as the teacher mission. And she hopes the lesson about space travel on the shuttle will not just be for youngsters.
People actually, adults have asked me, how many stops is that shuttle going to make? Bring me back a moon rock.
It's the kind of misinformation Kristen McAuliffe wants to correct. And it's why the high school teacher from New England won't be watching the next space shuttle launch. She'll be on it. Lynn Scher, ABC News, Concord, New Hampshire.
37-year-old Krista McCullough from New Hampshire, something of a risk-taker, as someone described her, and among the millions and millions of people today who will be excruciatingly saddened by this tragedy are a number of her own school children who went down to the Cape yesterday, Steve, and were expressing, I remember on World News last night, how disappointed they were that the mission had not got off last night.
And, of course, there were also the many students from her high school in New Hampshire who were all in an assembly room watching the launch on television and were quickly returned to their own rooms by the teachers and the staff at the school after the apparent tragedy took place.
Just to remind you of exactly when it did take place, and also to admit to you that we're very much as much in the dark as you are. We haven't heard much more from Mission Control than the bare basics. And it is, I think, probably, Steve, to some extent a reflection of how successful the space program has been, and the shuttle program particularly, that those of us, like you and me, who followed the space programs with absolute passion 10 and 15 years ago, have begun to take it rather like the country did, rather casually, not knowing all of the details of every mission as intimately as we would have 10 or 15 years ago.
And we should recap for those of us, for those of you who may have just have joined us, that on this 25th launch of the Space Shuttle program, there has been a tremendous explosion, what appears to be a major tragedy and setback for the space program. Some 90 seconds after launch, when all appeared to be going well, as you will see in just a few moments, suddenly this massive explosion and almost complete silence from Cape Canaveral.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
You can tell there so instantly that the Mission Control communicator, the rest of us, was hardly even looking at his screen or couldn't believe what's happened. And there you see, flying out of control, what we don't know, perhaps the solid rocket boosters, which are on the outside of the shuttle, or whether the external tank itself, which is attached to the shuttle, actually blew up. But at that point, they were going just under 2,000 miles an hour, 3 times the speed of sound. And if it, whatever it was, the solid rocket boosters or the external tank, it would have clearly driven the shuttle itself out of control. Let's listen to Mission Control.
Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
At this point, Challenger was 10.5 miles up and 8 miles out over the ocean. Debris has been scattered over a fairly wide area, some of it within 8 or 10 miles of Cape Canaveral itself. We cannot tell you, much to our regret, we cannot tell you what that is plunging towards the Atlantic Ocean. 7 crew members on board. Krista McAuliffe, the physical teacher. That parachute, by the way, perhaps a misleading picture for you. We said a few while ago that Challenger did not have an escape capsule on board. There is some belief seeping up from Houston and from the Cape that that may be someone of a rescue function parachuting into the Atlantic. But again, we cannot tell you with any certainty anything more than we have.
Peter, this was the 4th attempt for the launch of this particular shuttle flight. 3 previous ones had been forced to postpone because of either weather problems or technical problems, and even today there had been a delay. One because of a faulty fuel gauge, and another because of icicles on the launch pad, a temperature of 24 degrees this morning at Cape Canaveral.
John Quinones, who has been covering space for us down at Cape Canaveral, is now standing by at the Cape. And John, you clearly saw this with your own eye and not on a television monitor, am I correct?
That's right, Peter. I was outside with hundreds of spectators about 10 minutes before before the scheduled liftoff. The launching had been delayed 3 days due to bad weather. As we reported last night, it was rescheduled to finally leave at 9:38 this morning. But we had a hard freeze here in Cape Canaveral overnight, and when we arrived at the launch pad, we saw a launch pad deck covered with ice. Overnight, water and fuel systems had been kept draining, bleeding over that area so that the fluids on the spaceship or launch pad would not freeze. At about 8 this morning, NASA told us there was another problem with a fire detector, this time on board the Challenger. Some electronic components of that fire detector were replaced, and then we were told that at that time, all systems were go. The liftoff delayed by just 1 hour this morning and then rescheduled till 9:38. Finally, there were more delays. Apparently, the weather was a concern. Delayed till 11:38. Just minutes before the scheduled liftoff, I was out there in the spectator stands with hundreds of people, among them 18 school children from Krista McAuliffe's hometown, third-grade students who attended school with Krista's son, Scott Corrigan. Those children watched, gasping at the liftoff, very impressed, obviously. It appeared that very few of the spectators knew what had happened until about a minute into the liftoff when NASA Control announced that something had gone wrong. The Shuttle Challenger simply blew apart as we saw it from the ground. I am told with a force of 2.5 million pounds of thrust, awesome power that even NASA admits may leave very little to recover.
Let me ask you this. There must be turmoil there, John, at the Cape, as I'm sure there is in Houston as well. Do you have any indication from anyone there of an official or expert nature what may have happened?
No idea.
Well, that's simple, and that is clear, John.
We understand, Peter, that the recovery crews, we saw 2 parachutes that NASA cameras picked up and showed us floating to the ground. We are being told that it is believed that those are paramedics headed into the recovery area to see what they can find.
Okay, John, thank you very much. John Quinones at the Cape. Of course, once the Challenger was taken off mission control, that is to say the control of the mission shifts to Houston in Texas. And so at Cape Canaveral, why, as we suggest, there may be turmoil this morning, there is not an absolute amount they're going to be able, I think, Steve, to provide us in terms of information.
We've been told, Peter, that President Reagan was watching in stunned silence the replay after he was informed of what had happened. And one of the first recognitions of this morning's apparent tragedy came from the House of Representatives, which declared a moment of silence. The Reverend James David Ford, the chaplain, leading the House in the silence. Let's listen.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray.
Reverend James David Ford leading the House of Representatives in a moment of silence.
May your Spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
This recognition for the 7 crew members of the Shuttle Challenger. The Challenger exploding less than 2 minutes off the launch pad this morning. No official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members, but there is very little to hope for at this point.
I've just been thinking, Steve, as to why people at Mission Control, even people watching this on television, might not have been alarmed in the first instance, because about 2.5 minutes into flight, normally, when those big external tanks break off, we are accustomed now to seeing this great ball of fire as those 2 tanks drop off and fall into the Atlantic.
Sitting here watching protectively, because we take these for granted now, that was the first thought of all of us. Hopefully, this is just an aberration on the normal separation that takes place. Obviously, it was much more than that. Let's look now at tape of the crew members as they arrived at Cape Canaveral last week.
Thank you very much.
Astronauts Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ron McNair, Greg Jarvis, and of course, Kristen Collins.
And
These are from New Hampshire.
They represent a great deal of the country, too, as you look at their names and see them before the mission. Dick Scobie is from Washington State. Mike Smith was born in Beaufort, North Carolina. Judy Resnick was born in Akron, Ohio. Ronald McNair from Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onozuku was born on the island of Kona in Hawaii. And Greg Jarvis, who is the payload specialist on board the mission, was born, if I'm not mistaken, in Boston, but I'm not absolutely sure about that one either. The same thing, by the way, Steve, has happened in the House of Representatives, happened in the Senate. Senator Jake Garn from Utah, of course, had been the first politician who had flown in space, rushed over to the Senate floor where he wanted to make a statement. There's no question. I mean, again, I have to come back to this business at the White House. We were all sitting around waiting for the president, as is often traditional on the day of the president's going to make a State of the Union message. And his chief of staff is there, his aides, and the president is in the next room preparing to come in. And there is this stunned silence for the safety of individual Americans on something which, A, we've become so accustomed to, but B, has just become so symbolic of America, this search into space, when it all happened. I don't doubt this is happening all over the country.
And it is just a simple fact that we identify with these people as special people, even though we had come to take for granted the remarkable feats that they accomplish on a regular basis. This, the 25th launch of a space shuttle, and the first one to have anything like this happen to it. An obvious, terrible accident in air, an explosion less than 2 minutes after liftoff, after NASA officials had said the liftoff appeared to be completely normal, no indication of any trouble of any kind.
While we go on, by the way, we hope that someone behind the scenes is listening very hard to Mission Control in Houston and can we haven't heard anything from them in the last few minutes. They are very quiet, I am told, at the moment, but it behooves us, I think, not to write off these 7 people until we're told so by Mission Control. I was thinking of the president because it was he who made this determination that we'd have a teacher in space because the teacher was so symbolic of the aspirations of Americans in general. I think the president must have taken this very hard today.
11,000 applicants after the president made that announcement that the teacher would be the first private citizen in space. And Krista McAuliffe, the very dynamic and vivacious teacher from New Hampshire, the one who made the final selection. And as many of you saw just a few moments ago, Lynn Scher's report showing how much she obviously was enjoying her training as an astronaut. One of her colleagues at her school in New Hampshire describing her as something of a risk taker. Krista McAuliffe, among the 7 crew members aboard the Challenger when it exploded this morning.
The element of risk clearly is felt most poignantly by the families. Last week, for example, Kathy Lee Crosby on ABC was interviewing Krista McAuliffe's husband, Steve, and you get some sense there of enormous pride, but also anxiety. Let's look at that for a second.
What about Krista's special qualities? What do you think it is about her that's so special that she's bringing to this mission?
Oh, I think obviously she's very bright. She's a super teacher, and she's genuinely a nice person, and I think she has that ability to just excite people. Certainly, she's excited me over the years.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Has she been disappointed at all by the disappointments of the Space Shuttle Challenger or Columbia? What are those, the frequent delays in taking off, and then there was a difficulty in landing? Is she concerned about that?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think we've always looked at that as proof positive that they don't launch them unless it's absolutely perfect, and if there's anything the slightest bit out of order, they wait and correct it, and I certainly take comfort in that, and I wouldn't mind at all that it be postponed if there's something wrong.
You bet. We wish you all the best, Stephen. God bless. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Interview not with Kathy Lee Crosby, Kathy Lee Johnson on Good Morning America. Olive's husband, who says there's this tremendous confidence in NASA and the space program. And while we sometimes got very frustrated, and I must say took a few shots at NASA when Columbia was delayed 6 times, as I recall. There it goes again, something's gone wrong. It is that determination that's always existed in the space program to make sure that nothing goes wrong, which leads to these delays. And the search for what went wrong today, which, as you said earlier, is an incredible setback to the shuttle program at least, is just going to make, I think, people that much more conscious of safety as they were after the Apollo blow-up in '67.
When you look at husband Steve there in that tape recording, then you stop to realize that he and the 2 less than 2 minutes after the launch, the massive explosion in space.
It is now just a little after 12:30 in the eastern United States, and not by any means to repeat it for the sake of repeating it, but because that's a program change in many of the places around the country. We're going to run again the liftoff of the Challenger as it took off from Cape Canaveral this morning. John Quinones described it to us from the Cape just a few moments ago as perfectly normal in every respect. You'll recall it had been delayed yesterday because of high weather, and had been delayed the day before because they couldn't get a screw fully tightened down on one of the hatches. But for those of you around the country who may just be joining us now for the first time and may not have heard the news, perhaps not have seen it, here again is the liftoff of the shuttle from the Cape this morning. That is not the liftoff. That is the subsequent tragic result as something blows up about 7 to 10 miles above the Atlantic Ocean across the Cape. I must tell you, Steve, having now seen that 4 or 5 times, that great ball of fire looks to me like it may be one of the solid rocket boosters.
The enormous power, 2.5 million pounds of thrust, that is all a part of that launch that we have come to take so for granted. And that, of course, was the mix that we just saw exploding once again in that replay of what took place at shortly after 11:39 launch time, Eastern time this morning. The Space Shuttle Challenger with its crew of 7. We do not have any official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members. 2 women actually aboard, Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire, but also Judy Resnick, who was one of the mission specialists who had already logged 144 hours in space.
Okay. I'm told we can now look at the entire launch sequence, that is to say when the astronauts and the mission specialists went back on board early this morning, and there they are, liftoff from the Cape.
Space shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roll Challenger.
Nonchalant.
Roll program confirmed.
Control.
Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Accelerating towards 2,000 miles an hour.
Yes. 1,977 miles per hour, 10.4 miles up, 8 miles out at the time of the explosion.
And you are seeing that in slow motion, by the way, now.
Distance 7 nautical miles.
This the first in-flight disaster for the U.S. space program in 56 manned missions, going back to the original Shepard flight.
Steve, would you tell someone in our control room they have a key open that we're hearing everything that's going on in the building?
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Once again, for those of you who have just joined us, there has been a disaster on the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger with its 7-man crew. The shuttle exploding 1 minute, 15 seconds after launch from Cape Canaveral this morning. There had been a delay, one caused by a faulty gauge. There had also been a delay that was caused by ice forming on the pad because the temperature was 24 degrees this morning at Cape Canaveral. No indication that that had anything to do with the enormous explosion that took place as the shuttle was just reaching that maximum period of thrust in what had appeared to be an extremely normal launch. There was the normal excitement in the voice of mission control, and then the almost detached voice reading off the various numbers on what appeared to be a picture-perfect launch, but then was interrupted by this devastating explosion.
Steve, it is only now, 33 minutes after noon in the east, that all of the rescue teams are being allowed into what we will call the search area for the moment, because there was so much debris raining down from 10 miles up above that NASA feared for the safety of those people going to look for survivors, principally, is what they've got to look for. So only now, about 35 minutes after noon in the east, are people getting into the area to begin to search those waters of the Atlantic, which we have seen so desolate this morning.
And we might remind our viewers that while the earliest shuttles did have an escape capsule, the present ones have no particular escape mechanisms whatsoever. The capsule is its own entity.
It is that point in a mission where while the concern is immensely high at all times and you're beginning to push out towards orbit there, you're not as concerned. You'll recall in many of the space programs, the great concern has been for people on the launching pad.
Yes.
Back in 1967, when Gus Grissom, among others, was killed when the Apollo blew up on the launching pad, it became enormous concern for how do you get people out at that particular time. When the shuttle is driving for orbit and everything looks A-OK, you stop thinking about it
And
to
yet,
some extent.
the explosion occurred this morning, we're told, at about the time that the Challenger was to enter its period of maximum aerodynamic pressure, 526,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, all aboard, and the massive explosion.
The first flight disaster in 56 missions, and as Steve has been saying so accurately, this is the 25th of the shuttle missions. And this highly accelerated program, you'll recall just the other day, they had to move, was it Columbia or Challenger? I get them mixed up sometimes, from California back quickly in order to get it ready, because the mission program is really going, and there is a lot of demand now for people in all realms of industry, politics, the military, to get up and use the capacities that the shuttle has provided for the U.S.
In fact, the shuttle program becoming a point of controversy because the question is it competitive with the European unmanned program that's also been putting payloads into space for private industry and for other users? The delays that the shuttle program has been experiencing the last few months, and weather in some cases, technical in other cases, has led to many calls for a reevaluation of the shuttle program. That, of course, is going to be an enormous question at the present time.
For the moment, of course, it is a human question with 7 crew members on board and unaccounted for as the result of a devastating explosion on board Challenger this morning. We are again able to call on the services, as we do so often, of the former Apollo astronaut Gene Cernan, who at the moment is on a telephone in Houston. Gene, I know you have heard the news. Try again. Gene, do you hear me to start with? Gene, would you mind turning your television set down or the radio that is in your immediate vicinity, and perhaps we can hear you rather than it?
Okay, it's all down. I'm on private here.
Okay, well, then it is something at our end. Perhaps, Gene, if you'll stand by just for a second. I don't think we should impose that kind of sound on people. We very much want to hear what you have to say. Steve, I was talking about being at the White House this morning and saw the Vice President on the way in. He has also been very shaken by this. He was on his way to see the President. And the reaction in this city will have an enormous power because of the political impetus that the space program has been given by various administrations of the United States. The President and his particular attachment to sending a teacher into space to reflect American ideals. And we have now reaction in the White House then for the President, the Vice President. We have it in the Congress, at the House of Representatives, with moments of silent prayer. Senator Garn from Utah, really the first civilian or non-NASA person who was one of the overseers of NASA's program and NASA's budget. He went up. Everybody very much shaken in this capital, as best I can tell, certainly in my ear this morning, by this awful tragedy.
All of us shaken. Senator Garn, we're told now, is going to have a statement in about 20 minutes. He, of course, was the first member of Congress to go into space, a veteran pilot in his own right, and that's a perspective that you just don't share with anyone else.
Gene Cernan, I hope, is not standing by without a great deal of interference. Gene, can you hear me clearly now?
I sure can, Peter.
Talk to us for a bit. What do you think?
It's pretty tough to talk about a lot of things at this point in time. This is, I guess, the one catastrophic incident that we all knew was possible going way back to day one, I guess, in the always will be possible as we look into the future when man is involved in space that we couldn't quite fully protect against, except to build a vehicle that was obviously not 100, but 99+% safe. This is a thing we tried to legislate out again since day one, and successfully we did it. It's not enough to say that that you can justify exploration with human lives, although that's been the case historically. I guess that's where we find ourselves in today.
Gene, is there any particular point in the launch sequence that they might have been at that was known to be a critical point?
Well, of course, the first stages of just getting off the pad, the first several seconds, we all knew even in Apollo, the first 30 or 40 or 50 seconds of that flight, if something went wrong, the chances of getting through that phase were pretty grim. That would probably be true in the case of the shuttle also. What puzzles me is, though it was well on its way, it had enough, if you will, airspeed, it was going fast enough. Should they have recognized the problem, the shuttle was built to be able to get rid of that external tank, which was, I'm not going to speculate, but appears to be the major source of the explosion, because the solid rocket boosters appeared to break away from the force of the explosion and fly about their merry way without guidance. But the shuttle was designed to be able to, having recognized the problem,